Good morning. It's good to see you again. It's been a few weeks since I've been up here to speak with all of you. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. I also want to say welcome to any guests that we have. This is our normal ILA Convocation, but I know that a few other people might be joining us today, so thank you for being here and welcome. My name's Stephanie Baugh. I'm one of the coordinators of this course. And most of you know that the theme of ILA is self, stranger, and community. And if we take a moment and think about how our convocations have gone so far, we are at number 4 today, how are we thinking about this theme through these convocations, which is of course not our only intention with them. The first convocation given by Sonia Malunda, she spoke, I think we could say, to all 3 components of the theme. How do you think about your own life path? How do you have conversations with people who are different from you that you might consider strangers? And definitely, how do you become involved with communities and serve communities? And then our next 2 convocations, I think you'll agree with me, growth mindset and stress management. I think both of those fall pretty solidly into the self category. But I'll remind you that goal number 3 of ILA is that we will consider the dynamic relationships among self, stranger, and community. How do they intertwine? And so for that reason, and quite frankly for a lot of other reasons too, I think that today's topic is well suited to be part of the conversations of this course. So at this time, I'd like to invite to the stage Stephanie Kincaid, the Title IX officer from Monmouth College, who will introduce our speaker.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. So over the past few years, my friend Tim has worked in the field of sexual violence prevention and masculinity in over 250 keynote speeches that he's done across the U.S. And throughout his work, Tim has been a proud partner of JDOE, a spokesmo for the Movember Foundation, and a past board member of the nonprofit 1 in 6. Professionally, Tim received his master's in organizational leadership from Gonzaga, and I looked that up to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's Gozags. I know this now. And a bachelor's in communication from the University of New Mexico. But outside of his work, Tim is quite a talented artist, and he actually helped develop his 30-plus tattoos. It's fascinating. Ask him about tattoos if you're interested. And I've gotten to know Tim well over the last few years as he's visited our campus, and I consider him a friend, and I really want you to join me in welcoming Tim Mousseau.
Awesome. On. Perfect. There we go. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today. I know personally I'm extremely excited to get to spend this time with you and to talk with you. I also know where I'm excited. Most of you are probably confused. My bio really doesn't tell you that much about me. Many of you probably paid attention when it said I designed my own tattoos, and then I come out here and you're like, oh, I wonder why they brought a hipster to talk to us. I get it. I look like a barista, like I should be making you some kind of latte. I understand that. I promised I've never served you a cup of coffee. But I'm excited to be here with you today because we are going to talk about an important topic in the form of sexual violence prevention. But the way we're going to do that is a little differently, because the way that we are going to approach this topic is through the lens of storytelling. Storytelling is something that every single one of us does on a daily basis. If I were to sit down with each of you on an individual level and get to know who you were as a person, what you would do is you would tell me stories. You wouldn't just give me a bullet point list of, hey, here's who my name, here's where I'm from, here's what I'm majoring in, here's what I'm involved with, but you would actually tell me stories about yourself as a way of helping me get to know you. If we were to talk about an organization that you were a part of, a cause that you believed in, something that was critical to you, and we were to talk about why you invested in that thing. You wouldn't just tell me the values that it held or things like that, but you would actually tell me stories about experiences that you had had that connected you to that. Reasons that you invested in that thing. You would tell me stories about how that it specifically impacted your life. If we ever study any form of change, what we can see is that leaders create change through stories. Very rarely does someone say, hey, here's some data, and here's an issue, here's how we solve it. But instead, they tell stories as a way of driving forward momentum, stories that people can connect with to get them to create that change. Every one of us has stories that make us who we are. We tell stories to connect with the people around us, and we use stories to drive forward and change issues. So today we're going to talk about my story. We're going to talk about your story, and we're going to talk about stories of college students across this country. Now, to begin, what I want to ask you to do is I want to ask every one of you to think of a very specific story. The story that I want you to think of is, show of hands, how many of you have ever been on an awkward date? Great, I love asking that question because two things happen. First, there's people in the audience who raise their hand and look at me uncomfortably. And then second, there's this group in the audience that just stares at me blankly. Now, I hate to tell you, but if you were one of the people staring at me blankly, you probably were the awkward date. So show of hands again, how many of you have been on an awkward date? Notice a few more hands go up, and then there's a second group like, I've never been on an awkward date. I get it, maybe you haven't, don't worry, I promise at some point in your life you will get to go on an awkward date. It is a given, it will happen. I'm not going to ask you to share that story. That would be uncomfortable for all of us for you to get up here and share the story of the awkward date that you've been on, but think about that story. Think about how you would tell it if you were to tell it. Now, I'm willing to bet you two things about this. First and foremost, every one of you would have a different story. The story that you would tell would be unique to you. It might have some similarities to the stories of people around you, but the facts that you would share, the figures, the impact it had on you would be very different. Every one of us has unique stories that are unique to us. The second thing I'm willing to bet you on is that none of your stories are things that you are probably thinking about regularly. Sure, when I ask you to think about that, you can think of that awkward date. But if I were to sit down with you and we were to talk about the most important moments in your life, the stories that you felt like defined you, if you were to talk about the top 10 stories, 20 stories, 50 stories, 100 stories, that story wouldn't be one that you would share as a part of your identity. Because in life, we experience stories on a daily basis. But sometimes we experience stories that we forget as soon as they happen. Things that do not define us, things that are not a part of our identity. Other times we go through stories that shape us and make us who we are. Today, we're going to spend time talking about both of those types of stories. Now, to begin, since I asked you to think of a story of an awkward date that you've been on, I want to share with you the story of an awkward date that I went on. So it was not actually the first date, it was the second date. At the time, I was living in Denver, Colorado, and I met this woman, and her and I connected based on the fact that we were both writers. We also happened to both work downtown. And so we decided to meet up right after work for a cup of coffee. As we're sitting in this coffee shop talking, she looks at me and says, "Hey, I know that you have published a lot of stuff online, and I would love to read some of that." And I'm like flattered. I'm like, "Yeah, sure, that's cool. Yeah, we can do that." And then she goes, "Well, I see that you have your laptop with you. What if I were to read some of it right now?" And I think to myself, please no. I don't want you to judge me when I'm right in front of you, but I'm on a date. I'm trying to impress her. So what do? I open up my laptop, and I go to one of the bigger websites that I write for, and I pull up what's called my writer's profile. Now, my writer's profile is a series of all of the articles that I've ever published. Basically, what you can do is you can read through an article. When you get to the bottom, there's a hyperlink that will take you to the next page. I go to one of the articles that I'm proud of, and I turn the computer over to her. She starts to read it, and as she starts to read it, slowly and surely she starts to smile. And I think, fantastic. This is a great sign. She's enjoying it. This is awesome. She goes through, she reads this first article, she goes to the next page, she clicks to another link. And she does this a few times, and the entire time she's engaged, and I'm like, great, she is enjoying my writing. This is an awesome start. And then she clicks through to another link. And as she clicks through to this link, she stops. And she looks up at me. She gives me this look. It's a very specific look. And it's a look that I know really well because it's a look that I get from college students across the country when I speak with them. It is a look that I get from people on airplanes when I tell them what it is that I do. It is a look that I got from my family members at one very uncomfortable Thanksgiving. It is a look of fear. And it's a look of pity. And it is a look of shame that tells me that she thinks there is something wrong with me. Now, the reason that she's giving me this look is because the article that she came to is this. To the person, maybe, to the person who sexually assaulted me. You see, a part of my story that you don't know, that you can never tell by looking at me, is that I am a male survivor of sexual assault. And so today when I say that we're going to retake our story, what I mean is that we are going to change the way that we talk about this topic. Because so often the way that we talk about this topic in this country is broken. So often right now, the only times that we talk about sexual violence is when it has happened to someone in our community. By then we are far too late. So often when we talk about this topic, we do so in a way that individuals like me who have experienced some form of sexual violence are made to feel ashamed of what someone else did to us. And so often what we know is that we don't talk about this topic at all because it's a difficult topic and it is a hard topic and it's an uncomfortable topic. What we know is that sexual violence is one of the most preventable crimes that exist in this country. But if we can't talk about this the right way, if we can't have the right conversations around it, then how can we be expected to stop it? Before we go any further, though, I want to say this. I know that this is a difficult topic. And I know that there may be people in this room who have some form of experience with sexual violence. I am here today to help move this issue forward, not to cause any form of harm. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. There are also counselors on site if you need to talk to someone. And I know that I will stick around after this program to have whatever conversation I need to have with any one of you for as long as you need to. I also get that sometimes it's difficult to talk about this in person. I will give you my personal contact information, including my cell phone and my email, so if it's easier for you to connect with me that way, we can talk about it through that way. But I want to have whatever conversation you need to have on this. Please take care of yourselves today as we go through this and do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves. Because now I want to tell you my story. The story of my sexual assault. I want to talk about why that matters to you, and then I want to talk about what we can do about it. So my story doesn't actually begin until I'm 22 years old. At the time, I was working my first real job. I just finished up my master's degree, and I moved across the country to Indianapolis, Indiana. I was in a good relationship, I had good friends, and life was going well. And then one day, I was sitting at work, and the mail came. And the way, I got an envelope in the mail that day, and the way that this envelope was sent to me was kind of strange. Because instead of writing out my name and contact information, what the person did is they typed it out on the front of a piece of paper and taped that paper to the envelope. And there was no return address. So I got this envelope in the mail, and I thought it was pretty weird, but I didn't think too much of it until I opened it. Inside, there was a single piece of paper folded in half. On this piece of paper, there was a note typed out to me. This note talked about how in college, one of my good friends had died from suicide, and how the world would be a better place if I had killed myself as opposed to them. I remember reading this note over countless times, and I was furious. That's all I did the entire day is I read this note over and over again. And every time I read it, I got angrier and angrier because I had no idea how someone could use a friend's death against me like that. I was also confused because I had no idea why someone would use a friend's death against me like this. I had spent the entire day reading this note over. And at the end of the day, I took that piece of paper, I brought it home with me, and I put it in my desk drawer. And I said, you know what, if someone wants to waste their time, this is them, this isn't on me, that's them. And so I told myself I was going to forget about it. I forgot about it for about 2 weeks. Because 2 weeks later, another letter came. And surely enough, every few weeks, these letters started coming. Now, the person who was sending them to me wanted me to understand a few things. First and foremost, they wanted me to understand that they had power in the situation. They knew who I was, and I had no idea who they were. They knew things about my past, they knew things about my present. The second thing is this person obviously wanted to cause me harm. The letters were vile, they were derogatory, they were demeaning. This person wanted to hurt me as a result of sending these to me. This went on for a series of months. It became my new normal. I came to expect it. Every few weeks I knew I was going to get another letter. And it was never okay, but it's just what life was. And then one day everything changed. My job at the time, we hosted a very number of well-publicized conferences. A few days after coming back from one of those conferences, I was sitting in the office and I received mail sent to me from the hotel we'd been staying at. At this time, my name was written out by hand and the hotel seal was in the return address spot. So when I got this envelope in the mail, I thought it was a normal piece of mail. I thought that maybe I had a bill that I hadn't paid or the hotel was trying to send me something that I forgot. I will never forget the moment that I opened that envelope because inside were pictures of me being sexually assaulted. I remember opening the envelope, crumpling the photos in my hand, and making it as far as the front door of my office before I collapsed on the ground. Based on the fact that I have tattoos, we know beyond a reasonable doubt that it's me in the photos. Based on my tattoos, we know that I was likely 20 to 21 years old when the photos were taken. And based on how limp and lifeless my body looks in the photos, we know that I was likely drugged. Prior to that day, I had no idea that this is something that I had experienced. But that day was the beginning of hell. I called the police and I filed the police report, and they weren't able to do much for me. The letters kept coming, so eventually I hired a private detective, and we were never able to figure out who was sending me these envelopes. And because I didn't know what else to do and I didn't know who to trust at this time, I basically cut myself off from everyone in my life, and I started drinking. And I was alone, and I was angry, and I was drinking all the time. And this went on for months. And finally, after months of this, my mom, one of the few people who knew what had happened to me, called me. As we were talking on the phone, she told me how worried she was for me, because she was worried that if I didn't change something, I was going to hurt someone else, or I was going to hurt myself. And so she begged with me, and she pleaded with me, and she asked me just to see someone, just to try it, just see someone professionally. So I told her I would give it a chance. So I started talking to a counselor. It helped a little. So I kept going back, and slowly but surely this counselor helped me. She got me connected with other survivors. I was able to talk to survivors, which helped me feel normal again and made me feel like this wasn't everything about myself. And so slowly as time went on, I started to heal, and I started to get better. And the letters didn't stop coming, but I started to get better. And then eventually I left. I left Denver, or I left Indianapolis, and I moved across the country to Denver, Colorado. And I remember on that move thinking to myself, you know what, this is it. I'm done. I'm not going to think about this. I'm not going to talk about this. This isn't a part of my life. I am not going to let this define me. And for a while, things felt normal again. As normal as they could. There were still panic attacks. There were still nightmares, but I didn't think about it all the time. It was mostly okay. And then one day, things changed. It was something simple. I went out with 3 guys that I knew after work to grab a beer. As we're sitting down having this casual conversation, one of the guys in the group decided that it was an appropriate time to make a rape joke about one of the waitresses. So I called him out on it. But I was surprised because instead of this guy saying, you know what, you're right, I shouldn't have done that, that's not appropriate, that's not okay, this guy got defensive. And the other 2 guys we were with got defensive. Tim, it's just a joke. He wouldn't do that. It's just words. Don't be so PC. And as time went on, things got heated. And finally, one of them looked me in the eye and said, hey, why does this bother you so much? And so for the first time ever publicly, I said, and I told people out loud, it bothers me because I'm a survivor of sexual assault. So I don't find that funny. And things got uncomfortable. But then things kept getting uncomfortable because after this conversation, these guys that I thought I were friends with, I stopped hearing from them. Plans got canceled. So after about a month of this, I called the original guy out on it. And I remember that conversation, he told me, you know, that day when you told us that, you just made us feel uncomfortable. And so we decided to give it a break for a while. And I thought to myself, really? I made you uncomfortable because I told you what someone did to me that I had no control over, that I would take away in a heartbeat. I made you uncomfortable because I asked you not to joke about raping another human being. But I made you uncomfortable? And it bothered me that that was his reaction, but it didn't surprise me. Because I thought about other reactions I had received after I had told the few people I told. Like I thought about how at the time, because I was at work, I had to tell my then boss why I was calling the police. And his first question for me is, are you sure this isn't something that you did that you're embarrassed of? His second question for me is, are you sure you're not doing this to yourself for attention? And the third thing he told me is, you should make sure no one ever finds out about this because you may not be able to get a job. I thought how I told one of the men in my life, and because I wouldn't show him the photographs, he wasn't sure if he could believe me. And when I asked him why, he said because a real man wouldn't let himself get raped. And that bothered me. And I wanted to understand why so many people reacted this way, why sometimes people supported me, but why so often I was made to feel like this was my choice, like I somehow wanted this to happen. Like I somehow could have stopped someone from drugging me and raping me and stalking me. So I started to research it. And then I started to write about it, and I started to volunteer with it, and now I speak on it. Because no one should ever have to go through what I went through. No one should ever have to experience any form of sexual violence. And if someone has experienced a form of sexual violence, no one should ever be made to feel ashamed or afraid to turn to the community around them for support that they need out of fear of how that community is going to act towards them. But what we know is that it isn't just my story. This is the story of college students across the country. And not all of our stories are the same, not all the stories like mine, but there's still stories that exist. And it's important that we talk about the facts and the reality of how we're seeing this show up on college campuses. Right now, what we know is that on the average college campus, about 6% of men will experience some form of sexual violence during their collegiate career. Even more so, what we know is that across a man's lifetime, about 1 in 6 men will experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. For the average male survivor who does experience sexual violence, more often than not, this occurs before the age of 18. What this means is that there are men we know, men in our communities who are going through this. What we also know about male survivors is that for the average male survivor of sexual violence, due to the stigma that exists around it, it oftentimes will take them 20 years to seek out help and support around that. Because they want to wait till they have a community established, they're in a relationship, and they have a career before they talk about it. That doesn't mean that they're not processing this trauma, it just means that they're not seeking out support for it. And generally what we also know for male survivors is that they don't hurt other people, they hurt themselves. Another number we have to talk about is right now what we know on the average college campus is about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 women will experience some form of sexual violence during their collegiate career. Now my bet is you have heard this number. It's one of the most talked about numbers we have. 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 women will experience some form of sexual violence during their collegiate career. This is the number I get the most pushback on. Sometimes people tell me that's too high, that can be possible, the research is biased, things like that. Well, a few things. First and foremost, every few years we do studies. When I say we, I mean the CDC, I mean the Department of Health, I mean the World Health Organization. I mean public institutions and private institutions. I mean myself and a business partner who has worked with 100,000 undergraduate students across 575 campuses. Every few years when we do these studies, what we find is that 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 women will experience some form of sexual violence during their collegiate career. Now, part of the other problem that we oftentimes have with this is that many times what we know is we have not always done a good job of training people what sexual violence looks like. More often than not, the average person thinks of sexual violence as violent, penetrative rape. Yes, that is a form of sexual violence, but sexual violence is an umbrella term. Yes, it is violent, penetrative rape. Yes, it is also sexual assault. Yes, it is sexual harassment, whether verbally or physically. Yes, it is intimate partner violence, dating violence, and domestic violence. It is stalking electronically or in person. It is sexual misconduct, things like catcalling, unsolicited nude photos, sharing someone's photos without permission. Sexual violence is a variety of behaviors. All of them can cause trauma and all of them can cause harm. All of them are serious. We also know sexual violence exists on a continuum. We cannot normalize any of those behaviors and say, well, that's just the way things are, that's just how things happen, because what we know is that they build off one another. But what we know is that the average female student will experience 1 in 4 to 1/5 of the average female students will experience some form of sexual violence during their collegiate career. Now the next number we got to talk about is one that we don't oftentimes do a good job talking about. Right now what we know is that within the LGBTQIA community, 29% of men, 44% of women, and 64% of individuals who identify as transgender will experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. Now the reason I use the lifetime statistic is because we have not done a good job of studying how sexual violence shows up for the LGBTQIA community on college campuses. We have largely failed this community. This is an area we need to do a better job in. Part of what this means for us is we need to think about how we can elevate those voices on our campus and make sure that they have a place leading this conversation, because we know members who identify with and are part of the LGBTQIA community experience categorically higher levels of sexual violence at every point in their life. Now the next number I got to talk about with the men in the room. 90%. Right now what we know is that all incidents of sexual violence that occur, regardless of the gender of the survivor, in 90% of those incidents, the assailant is a male. In 90% of incidents of sexual violence that occur, regardless of the gender of the survivor, the assailant is a man. Sexual violence is a male's issue. Overwhelmingly, we are the ones doing it, even when it's happening to us. Now guys, To the men in the room, I get it, because I've been in your shoes. I had to go through these mandatory programs in college. I remember sitting through this stuff. I remember walking out of those programs, and I remember guys around me being upset. And they would say things like, well, I feel like I'm being blamed. I feel like I'm being attacked. I would never do that. I'm not responsible for that. That's not the type of man that I am. And I'm tired of being blamed. Gentlemen, here's the thing I will also tell you. What we know is that on the average college campus, less than 6% of men would willfully engage in acts of sexual violence if they were given the opportunity. Those men are oftentimes responsible for a majority of the egregious acts of sexual violence that are occurring. So guys, men, I am not blaming you. I am not saying that you were the ones doing it. What I am telling you is that men are the ones doing it. And if we are going to ever stop sexual violence, it is on men to lead the charge in this. That is not placing blame on your shoulders, but it is telling you that now that you know these figures and these facts, if you don't do anything about this, that makes you complicit. Because sexual violence is largely a man's issue. And we as men need to step up and take the charge in this. I am not blaming you, but men, I am asking you how you can help me. Because the last number we know is the hardest one to talk about on any college campus. Right now, on a college campus, in 80 to 90% of assaults that occur, a survivor knows their assailant. Whenever I walk into any college audience, I know three things to be true. I know within that college audience there are already people who have experienced some form of sexual violence. I know that if things do not change, there are people in that audience that will experience some form of sexual violence by the time they leave that campus. And I know the people that are perpetrating that violence are either in that room, in that community, or will join that community in the next few years. That is a very hard pill to swallow. And it's a difficult thing to talk about. Now, I will tell you this. This is the reality of our world. This is the situation we live in. You don't have to like it. As a matter of fact, I don't want you to like it. This should make you angry. This should make you upset. I don't tell you this, though, to make you scared. I'm not here to terrify you. I know that many of you are at the beginning of your college experience. That's why we're in this room together. I am not here to scare you. The reason I talk about this stuff is because what we know is that when we do a better job of educating around this, when we actually have meaningful conversations around this, when we can talk about the data in the right way, we are making change. We have cut down the number of sexual assaults in this country by half since 1990 because we're having conversation around it. But if we don't understand what this looks like, if we don't understand how to stop it, then we can't stop it. So I get that this is a difficult conversation, but we have to have it. I know many of you don't want to be in this room. I don't want to either. I love my job. I am very fortunate to do my job. I don't want to be having this conversation anymore. I have to have this conversation, though, because we are not at the place of stopping this yet. That is not the reality of our situation. I believe we can get to a place where we can stop it. The thing is, I need you to help, because I can't do this alone. I need you to help me in creating change. Now, I know that's easier said than done because I also think about my own college experience. When I was in college, I was an orientation leader. And for 2 summers, I worked across 24 sessions with 5,000 incoming students. And in those orientations, I was in a skit where, ironically, I played the role of the man who's accused of sexual assault. After those sessions were done, I would sit down and have facilitated dialogues with the incoming students around these topics. I knew these facts, these figures, these numbers. I led conversations on this. The problem is, after those conversations, I did 3 things that most of us do. I walked away from those conversations and said, hey, I am friends with good people. No one I know could ever do this. I looked around at my community and I said, hey, no one's coming forward and talking about this, and they're not saying this is an issue. So obviously, yes, I know this happens on other campuses. It's not happening here. We're different. And I looked at myself. And I said, I'm a good person. I was raised differently. And I also said, you know, I am a man, it's not going to happen to me. In those moments, it's not that I was doing anything predatory and I wasn't doing anything problematic. I just wasn't doing anything because I didn't think it was my issue. I didn't hear about it, I didn't see it, I didn't think it was my problem. I know that's where most people are. We know it's an issue, but we don't think it's a part of our community, we don't think it's a part of our groups, we don't think it's happening around us, and so we check out. I know the other problem is that for many of you, you may be saying, look, if this isn't happening around me, or I don't know about this, or I haven't experienced this, how do I help? Because I'm not the one doing it. So how do I stop it? So that's what we're going to talk about. How do we stop it? Now the thing is, I am not going to ask a lot of you today. I'm not going to ask you to change your life. I'm not going to ask you to necessarily donate money or time. I'm going to ask you, every one of you, to do a few simple things. Because what we know is that if more people do these things, it builds up over time, and it begins to create a change in the way that we're having this conversation and the way that we're approaching it. So where does it start? Well, first and foremost, where it starts is in your individual relationships. Now, when I say relationships, that is going to mean something different for every one of you. For some of you, that might be one lifelong monogamous relationship. For some of you, that might be a series of long-term relationships. For some of you, that might be casual dating. For some of you, that might be hookups, friends with benefits, or one-night stands. It might be a mix of those things. However you define your sexual and intimate partner relationships, part of what I need you to do a better job of is I need you to focus on how you are talking with your partners about sex. Now, I know that sounds easy, and it sounds simple. It's not as easy as it sounds, though. Part of what we know is what research has found is that the younger someone is, the less likely they are to talk with their sexual partners about the sex that they're having. Part of the reason for this is that we as a country have done a terrible job of teaching people how to talk about sex. Our system is inherently flawed. You've grown up in a flawed system. We do a terrible job, not only in this country but around the world, teaching people how to talk about sex. The way we've talked about it is we've created a lot of shame around it. So here's what I want you to think of. Show of hands, how many of you remember the sex talk that you received growing up? Great. So what we know, some of you get that, some of you will. What we know in the United States is that if you went through what's considered a good sex talk, you were probably taught how to put a condom on a piece of fruit. My guess is that that piece of fruit was a banana. If they use a different type of fruit, that's a really weird sex ed program. If you went through what I would call a bad sex talk here in the United States, you were taught, hey, don't have sex until marriage or you will die. I'm not sure where the death piece comes in. It's not true, but that's what you were taught, and there was a lot of guilt and shame involved in it. Some of you went through what I went through, which is what I like to call the parental sex talk. At a certain point in 6th grade, my parents decided it was a time to have a conversation with me about sex. My mom specifically pulled me aside after school one day and said, hey, can we take the dog for a walk? Fun fact, it wasn't even our dog. At the time, my neighbor paid me to walk his beagle named Elvis. And so as we're walking the neighbor's dog, my mom and I are having this conversation, and she says, hey, recently I know that your school sent home a form with you, and I want to make sure that they did a good job in that form, talking about the things that they said they were going to talk about. Now, I'm in 6th grade. I have no idea what she's talking about. And so I'm like, sure, yeah, let's talk about this. She just starts by leading into it by saying, yeah, like I know they talked to me about some very sensitive stuff, but I want to make sure they did a good job. Like, did they teach you how to properly use protection? And I was like, a bicycle helmet? My mom quickly clarified that she was talking about condoms. And I freaked out. But the conversation went on from there, and it got more awkward and more awkward until eventually I was stung by a bee. Now, I'm deathly allergic to bees, so we had to go get an EpiPen. So during the birds and the bees conversation, I was saved by a literal bee. Now, as awkward and as uncomfortable as that was, and as much as my mom hates that I tell this story, the thing is I am very fortunate. I am very fortunate that I had parents who were willing to teach me about many of the principles around sex, because what we know is that our society does a terrible job with this. What we know is that for many of you, for most of you, you were taught maybe, in the best cases of scenario, how to have protected or safe sex. But the problem is what we know is that the average person isn't taught more than that. And there's a very large difference between protected sex and healthy, communicative, enjoyable sex. So that's part of what we have to talk about. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today, how you can have healthy, communicative, enjoyable sex. The guy in the back finally got excited. He was like, yes, I'm going to take notes now. Didn't expect this to happen today in class. Right, so how do we do that? Well, it comes down to a term that we all know and love, and that term is this: consent. Now, here's the thing that I love. I make a few jokes about my awkward sex talk. I make a joke about a guy taking notes. Everyone laughs. It gets a little lighthearted for a reason. And then all of a sudden, I put consent on the screen, and people shut up, and they look uncomfortable, and they get angry. And I understand it, because you've had a lot of people talk to you and down to you about consent, and you've received a lot of really bad education around consent. Many of you, all you have learned is things like yes means yes, no means no, and don't rape. Yeah, those are all true. Those are the bare minimum of consent. We have done a terrible job of teaching this in the United States, to the point that what we know right now is that 40% of incoming college students don't understand the complexities of consent. 40% of incoming college students don't understand the complexities of consent. When you couple that with the fact that the younger someone is, the less likely they are to talk with their partner around sex, that number terrifies me. Because what we know is that if you can't talk to the people that you were going to have sex with about the sex that you were having, in the best cases of scenario, even though you didn't seek out consent, you have consent and you stumbled into it. But in the worst cases of scenario, you didn't have consent and you have committed an act of sexual violence. Now I want to say two things at this point. First and foremost, I am not saying that if every one of you talks about consent in your own individual relationships, we will prevent all forms of sexual violence from occurring. People choose to engage in predatory sexual behaviors. The man who did this to me does not care about consent. So we have to watch out and figure out how to stop those predatory behaviors. But what I will also say is oftentimes when I do this program, I hear this other group come up to me and they will tell me things like, Tim, I thought we had consent. I thought we were on the same page. They were acting in a way that I thought this was going on. I didn't know how drunk they were. I thought we were okay. And what I have to talk with that group about oftentimes is it doesn't matter what your intentions were. It doesn't matter what you thought was going on. You didn't have consent and you have now committed an act of sexual violence. It doesn't matter your intentions. If you commit an act of sexual violence, you commit an act of sexual violence. That act is now there. You cannot take it back. You cannot take it away. You have changed someone's life. You've committed harm. You've caused trauma. So I need you to talk about consent. We need to be having better conversations around this. And again, it sounds simple, but we know when people are younger and it's their first time with a partner, they're not likely doing this. Now here's the bad news. I cannot tell you specifically how to have these conversations. I don't know what's going to necessarily work for you because I'm not going to be there with you. And for every one of your partners, it's going to be a very unique thing. Every partner you're with can have this conversation differently. For some of you, you may start having this conversation when things start to get sexual. Things are heating up and you say, hey, we got to talk about sex. Perfect. Sometimes people give me pushback and say, hey, that's going to kill the mood. Let me tell you this. Nowhere in the history of the world has the following interaction ever happened. Person A says, hey, before we go any further, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Is it okay if we do this? Are you okay with this sexually? And person B goes, you know, I was really turned on by you until you respected me as a human being and cared about my sexual desires, but now everything's off. Talking with your partner is going to make sure you have consent. It's going to lead to better sex. So it may happen when things start to get physical. For some of you, it might happen on the date beforehand. Fantastic. You're having a good date, you can bring it up then. Some of us may use technology to do it. We've all heard of a little thing called sexting. Some of you are good at it. Many of you think you're good at it. Guys, just a piece of advice, stop sending unsolicited dick pics. It's true. It's true, right? Yeah, there we go. Gentlemen, if you were ever in a situation where it is a Friday night and you were home alone and you're thinking to yourself, you know what, I'm bored, I'm going to send a picture of my penis to like 4 people, don't. Because no one ever woke up at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning and go, oh, there's a random dick on my phone. Don't do it. If you have permission to send a picture of your genitals, congratulations, be proud. You should probably have a conversation with your partner about what they're going to do with that photo once they have it, but if you have permission, do it. If you don't, don't. You don't have consent to do that. And as much as we can laugh about this, what we know is that Texas was just actually, surprisingly enough, Texas was the first state to criminalize this. They made it a misdemeanor. It is now an act of sexual harassment. Because what we know is that 40% of women receive unsolicited dick pics. If you don't have consent, you can't do it. If you have consent, you can engage in those sexual activities. You need to be communicating around this. Now, there's some questions that come up oftentimes when we have this conversation around consent. First and foremost, if we're communicating with someone, we know the communication means that they have to be conscious. They have to be conscious to have that communication. We all get that. The other thing is sometimes people ask, hey, what about nonverbals? Well, the thing I will tell you is, yes, you can get consent from nonverbals, but the problem is it's very easy to misread nonverbals. And what we know is that college students significantly overestimate the nonverbal cues that they're receiving. It's also just hard. Many times we are not taught how to do this, and we'll misread them. So yes, you can receive consent through nonverbals, but if you do not have an established sexual history with someone, you don't know what their nonverbal cues are. And we know that we're likely to overread them. There's an idea called coercion. Coercion is the concept that if you have to keep asking someone to have sex with you, and they say yes, it is not because they actually gave you consent. It's because you wouldn't stop asking. And what you have shown them is that you do not respect their no, or that they even have a reason to be afraid of you because you were willingly ignoring their no. No's can also come through silence. Just because you have consent to one sexual activity with someone does not mean you have consent to every sexual activity. Just because you have consent one time doesn't mean you have consent every single time. Things change. Your different partners are going to like different things. So just because one partner likes something doesn't mean all partners will like it. Now, one of the biggest issues that we oftentimes see on college campuses is the role of drugs and alcohol in consent. So question for you. Can you give or get consent if you are drinking or using drugs or your partner is drinking or using drugs? Show of hands, who says yes? Who says no? Okay, you are wrong, because it depends. Now, I will tell you there is no black or white answer here, but what we know is that in many jurisdictions, in many ways, and even on a human level, you can give or get consent if you are drinking or using drugs. You cannot the second that one of you crosses a certain line. Usually it's a line of drunkenness, intoxication, or incapacitation. The problem is none of you were trained to know when that line is and when someone has crossed that line. So yes, generally, depending on the substance it is, and depending on the jurisdiction, depending on who's talking about it, you can give or get consent if you're drinking or using drugs. You cannot, though, the second that someone crosses the line of intoxication and incapacitation. Again, you don't know when that line is. It can also change and fluctuate. It changes based on how much drugs or alcohol someone has in that system from earlier that day or the day before. It changes on the type of food they ate. It changes on whether they're sick, whether they know they're sick, whether they're on medication. It changes on whether they're excited to be somewhere, because generally what we know is that when someone is excited to be in a place, their brain releases chemicals that allow them to consume more. All those things impact your ability to be intoxicated or incapacitated, and those can change on a regular basis. We have to be careful with this, because what we know right now is that 67% of college students are comfortable hooking up or having sex while drunk or high. Well, that also means it's 33% are not. One time I was doing this program at a school in Texas, and a woman came up to me after the program and she told me her story. Her story is that a few weeks prior to me coming there, she had broke up with her then long-term boyfriend. And about a week went by and her friend said, hey, you know what, we're going to go out, we're going to have fun, we're going to help you forget about this guy. That night, they went to a party, there was a guy in the friend group that she knew really well, and they got extremely drunk. As the night went on, this man and this woman eventually went home and they slept together. And she said, Tim, I didn't know what to do the next day. We talked about the legal ramifications of it. This woman said, hey, look, I've already talked with this guy, neither of us wants to press charges. But that's just not who I am. You see, for her, she was raised fairly religious. And it's not that she wanted to wait until marriage, it's that she wanted to be in a committed relationship with someone before she engaged in any sexual activity. So we talked about it, and she said, that's not who I am. That's not who I am as a person, that's not who I want to be, that's not the type of sex I want to be having, but I don't know how to talk to my friends about this, I don't know how to talk to this guy about this. I've known him for 2 years, we have classes together. This woman and I stayed in touch. After a few weeks, she asked if she could call me. As we were talking on the phone, she said, you know, Tim, the last few weeks I've been so incredibly angry, and I didn't know why. She said, I finally figured it out. She said, that night, every one of my friends knew I was too drunk. And any one of them could have stopped me. Why didn't they stop me? Yes, I need you to seek out consent in your own sexual relationships, but I need you to also watch out for the people around you, the people who are in this room, the people who are part of this community. I need you to pay attention to each other because you have the ability to impact each other's lives. This includes people you do not know. Part of what I need you to do is I need you to watch out for each other, and I need you to talk about sex with each other in non-sexual relationships. Your friends that you're forming, the people you're living with, I need you to have conversations around sex. Because what we know is that every one of us believes different things around sex. We have different sexual values around sex. We engage in different behaviors around sex. But here's the thing I can tell you. If the first time you were trying to talk with one of your friends about sex is when things are going bad, when they make an inappropriate joke, when they are too drunk to go home with someone, or the person they're trying to go home with is too drunk, when you're worried that they may be in an unhealthy relationship, that is not going to be a productive conversation. I need you to do a better job of talking about sex with your friends and your classmates and your peers so that you know how to support each other and you also know how to challenge each other. Now, part of the issue with this is I need you to be careful, though, about the language that we're using when we talk about sex, because what we know is that language matters. One of the hardest programs I ever did on this program, I was brought to a campus to work with one athletic team. The reason I was working with that athletic team is because a few months prior to me being there, 3 men on that team raped a woman. And I was working with these men's teammates while these 3 men were in jail awaiting trial. Now, at the end of one of the first sessions, a guy came up to me towering over me. And he looked down at me and he simply said, Tim, I am sorry. What he apologized for was pretty simple. He said, Tim, the way the guys on the team talked about women, the terms they used, the jokes they made, the things they said, I knew it wasn't right. I was raised better than that. But that's what we did. So meals, locker rooms, games, that's what we did. And I went along with it. I laughed along with it. I never said anything. I knew it wasn't right, but I never said anything. I said, Tim, I am sorry. I never said anything. I said, I'm really sorry, because one of the guys who used to make the worst jokes, he is in jail right now for raping that woman. Those 3 men were found overwhelmingly guilty of that rape. There was undeniable evidence of it. The man who apologized to me was not there that night in question. He was in no way, shape, or form involved in that incident. He had no part in it. And I can't promise you that if he had spoken up sooner, he could have prevented it. What I can tell you, though, is that on a neuro-linguistic level, what we know is that when we use sexually violent and derogatory language, we are more likely to engage in or be complicit in acts of sexual violence. When we use sexually violent and derogatory language, we are more likely to engage in and be complicit in acts of sexual violence. So I need you to think about, how are you going to talk about sex? What jokes will you allow? How will you refer to someone of a different gender identity or sexual orientation? What terms will you use? What stories will you tell about sex? If one of your friends goes home with someone, what do you say to your friend's face versus what do you say behind their back? What do you say about the person that they went home with? I need you to pay attention to this and be careful about it. Because the other thing we know is that when we are using sexually violent language, and what we also know is in cultures where we have high levels of slut shaming, what we have found is that survivors of sexual assault are less likely to seek out resources that they need, even on an anonymous level. When we are using violent, demeaning, and derogatory language, survivors are less likely to seek out resources that they need. They're not likely to come forward. Now, I know not every one of you is going to have this conversation. Not every one of you is going to have to talk with a survivor in your life, but I will tell you that too many of you have, and too many of you will. So we have to think about how we can support survivors. If someone comes to you and tells you that they experienced a form of sexual violence, and it just happened, get them to a safe space. If they're talking about something that happened in the past, make sure it's a safe time to have that conversation. If the assault just occurred, let them know that they can recommend that they seek out medical attention. The key word there is recommend. Sexual violence is an act of power and control. When you are sexually assaulted, you lose power and control. You cannot force that person to do anything. So make sure that you recommend for them that they do that, letting them know that it may help them collect evidence if they like to. The hospital may call the police. Also let that person know that legally they do not have to press charges. Be there for that person. They have trusted you for a reason. First and foremost, respect their privacy, especially in a community of this size. That is not your story to tell. You don't get to tell that without their permission. The stories I tell today, I have explicit permission too. So keep that between the two of you. I get that can be hard. I recommend for you, as you experience that trauma as well, you seek out support. Believe that person. It is not your job to adjudicate. It is not your job to figure out facts and details. It is your job to believe them. Survivors of sexual violence experience complex PTSD at higher levels than any other population in the world. PTSD literally changes your brain and the way that you view the world. It changes the information that they are willing to tell you. They may not tell you everything. That is okay. It doesn't mean they're lying to you or hiding